Training, gender and development, or gender mainstreaming. Welcome to the second segment. I will start the module one with gender-based violence. What is gender-based violence? It actually refers to violence against women, or it could be men actually, but most times we refer to it's discussed as violence against women because it involves women. So it's an act that violates the human right of women. It has brought negative impact on their lives, and this effect include physical, psychological, economic harm, considering the fact that girls and women are the most affected by this. Now, violence against women is different, form of gender-based violence. Actually, there are other acronyms used to refer to this. Now, types of gender-based violence. There are different types of gender-based violence, and it can actually occur at any time, and different times and locations. GBV or gender-based violence can happen in the following relationships: one, intimate relationship between men and women, that is boys and girls, perpetrated by husbands and intimate partners. It can also happen uh, by friends and family members, which is perpetrated by friends, fathers, brothers and sisters, brothers and other family members. It is also perpetrated, between teachers and students, for those in the position of power or leadership. It's perpetrated by teachers, religious, spiritual leaders, employers, and police or security officers. It also between strangers and perpetrated by strangers, as the case may be. Military and times of conflict, during times of conflict by military, it's also perpetrated by the police, soldiers, military or military members, and supporters of particular political group. Also political leadership, such as head of municipalities and other staff. So that all these people are involved in the perpetration of gender-based violence. So there are other causes of gender-based violence. One of them is sociological factor. So socio-cultural factor is one of them, and it has to do with unequal power relations. It has to do with low status of women in society, low socialization, traditional issues and custom, beliefs, attitudes, illiteracy, and limited education. All this constitute some of the factors for gender-based violence. Someone who has low education might not understand the implication of, battering a woman or a girl, and so that could be a factor. So, for example, a girl graduated from high school in her hometown, but since there's no university in her town, her family, due to this culture, doesn't allow a girl to study abroad or at the other city nearby, and so she has to, stay back and not go to school because the university which she could have attended is a bit far from, the home. But a boy is allowed to do that. So there are legal factors too, which include a dual legal system, archaic laws. It has to be lack of commitment to the international laws and inadequate legal provisions. Inaccessibility of legal services by most people, attitude of judicial officers, including both judges and law officials, ignorance of rights and responsibilities. So, for example, there are cases of rape where the judge in some cases or in some jurisdiction has decided the survivor married the perpetrator. As a result, the survivors lack trust in the courts. Now, there's economic factor to gender-based violence, such as economic independence, poverty, limited opportunity, income sources, lack income sources, lack of control of resources, and then the economic dependency of families of females on males in the community increases their vulnerability to violence, and gender-based violence, mostly from family members. When someone is over dependent, it becomes they become victims. Institutional factors include lack of adequate survival support services and, of course, distance from courts as well as health facilities. So there's police services, for example, lack of trust in the institution It's one of the main causes that survivors don't seek support. They prefer to stay in, and stay in subject to the violence than seeking justice, in addition to the traditional and cultural factors that belief will bring stigma to the family honor if the survivor seeks, this support. The most common form of gender-based violence is generally, is physical violence. Due to the weak and sometimes non-existing protection mechanisms, physical violence in some parts of the world, like Nigeria, has become the predominant form of violence. That's physical ones. For example, the statistics of married Nigerian women who have experienced some form of abuse at the hand of their husbands is staggering. It is staggering. Some of the reports we receive in our report desk about gender-based violence is staggering. Physical violence against women around the world is not related to the crisis displacement, only to the crisis displacement, war, and difficult living conditions. These are independent problems. In Nigeria, the Violence Against Persons Act, they call it VAP Act, prohibits assault against the person. You see, but the entrenched discrimination against women, the fact that women still do not enjoy equal opportunity or treatment in regard to their rights and needs is worrisome. For the women who are GBV survivors, it is hard to get legal protection because the law basically does not criminalize domestic violence. There is no specific law against domestic violence, so women have been, to rely on whom they go to court. The point is this: you go to police station to report your husband for battering you, want to shattering you, and then the police will be like, "Is this they can't get involved with this? That is a family matter. Go and settle your matter with the same person who is trying to kill you by beating the hell out of beating you to pulp." Now, gender-based violence and human rights. That is human rights. Let's look at gender-based violence and human rights. Now, GBV violates fundamental and universal human rights of the person. It violates the right to life. It violates because people can die from violence. The right to personal security. People lose their security because of that. It violates the right to physical integrity because of the injury they may suffer, and also equal protection under the law. Now, our right to freedom it also violates the right to freedom from torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. It's actually very, violence against women is a cruel thing, is a torture, is an inhuman, and degrading treatment that should not be meted against a woman. So, human rights are found, on the basis of respect for the dignity and worthiness or value of each person. Human rights are universal, meaning that they are applied equally and without discrimination to all people. Human rights are inalienable. That means no one can give it and no one can take it. So no one can actually, have his or her human rights taken away other than in respect of specific situation, which the law provides. So women's rights are human rights, and discrimination on the basis of sex is against international human rights standards. So women, especially in less developed climes, are usually disproportionately represented among marginalized, they are marginalized, they are discriminated against, they are excluded, and they are at risk simply because of their gender. There are numerous international treaties, like we saw earlier, the conferences and all that in part one. A lot of these conferences came about with treaties and declarations that address specific human rights, political, economic, social, cultural, and religious. And of course, some are directly relevant to gender-based violence, such as the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, known as International Bill of Rights for Women, and of course, the optional protocol to the Convention, of 1999. And it was called Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, 1993. This actually provided a framework for analysis and action for national and international levels, and also defined gender-based violence as this convention defined gender-based violence as any act of gender-based, you know, the violence that result in or is likely to result in physical, sexual, or physiological, psychological harm or suffering to women, including threat of such acts, coercion, or arbitrary deprivation of liberty, whether occurring in public or in private life. That's a lengthy definition there. Now, most countries have ratified these conventions, hundreds of them, and have an international commitment to work on implementation of these conventions. Basic working knowledge of human rights can also help, inform and guide our interactions with the population we serve. So, as the gender-based or women rights defender, we need basic knowledge of this right. You don't have to know everything about these conventions, but at least have a basic understanding of them so that you can use that to protect others. Now the gender-based violence involves the abuse of power. To understand GBV, risk and vulnerabilities, it is important to understand the power dynamics in the communities we serve. So to address gender-based violence effectively, you must understand and analyze the power relations among men and women, the one among women and women, the one among men and men, adults and children, and of course among children. These are all indices, these are all classes. You need to understand power involves the ability. It involves skills, capacity to make decisions and take actions. It involves physical force or strength. All these are indices of power. And of course, power is a form, or it is one of the factors that encourages violence. So exercise of power is an important aspect of relationships. The more power a person has, the more choices are available to that person. People who have less power have fewer choices and are therefore more vulnerable to abuse. Discrimination, oppression, and GBV or gender-based violence are expressed in many different ways by different people. Women and girls consistently experience different forms of oppressions because they do not have power. Now, power is not always physical. In the context of violence and abuse, most people think of physical abuse, which includes physical, size and strength, as well as designated roles such as soldiers, police, and gangs. But you see, physical power may involve the presence of weapons and or controlling access or security, such as at checkpoints. However, there are many different types of power that are relevant in the context of gender-based violence that is not physical. One of them is social or community power. Another one is economic power, political power, gender-based power, and age-related power. Let's discuss all this briefly. So for social power or community power, it involves community leaders, teachers, parents, are very powerful because all these people are very powerful because of their role in the family and the community. That is, the community leaders, teachers, and parents. Economic power has to do with control of money or access to goods, services, money, or favors. Husbands and fathers often hold the economic power in families. They are the breadwinners. They usually have they hold the economic power. Communities, big business owners can be extremely powerful as well. Of course, elected for political power, it's true that elected leaders have power. There are powers in laws and how those laws are carried out, which can result in abuse if the law do not provide adequate protection for the vulnerable. Now, in most cultures, male are usually in a more powerful position than female. Usually, that's the norm. So, what about gender-based social age-related power? Now, in most cultures, males are usually in a more powerful position than females, like I said, and children and elderly have less power. Let's talk about gender and development very quickly. That is all about gender-based violence. Let's talk about gender and development, very important aspect of this training. So let's start with addressing gender inequalities in societies. You see, there are three basic strategies developed by the UN, the United Nations, to address gender inequalities affecting women, especially those in developing countries where male dominant cultures, cultural practices still affect intervention projects aimed at empowering women and improving their conditions or livelihood. These strategies include one, the Women in Development (WID). We have the Women and Development (WAD), and Gender and Development, that is GAD strategies. These are all strategies used to achieve gender development. So, Women in Development is the one we want to start with. WID approach emerged during the first UN Women Conference in Mexico in 1975. The approach was based on the realization of the important role women played in national economic and development process. We've discussed some of these things, but in part one. But let me just rephrase some of them. It was designed to facilitate women's role in extending development. It therefore called for more recognition of women in developmental processes, and of course, that they should be given more opportunities to address their potentials in the process. So, women and developmental. That's the next one is WAD, women and development. So the WAD initiative was developed as a result of shortcoming of the WEED. Its proponents argued that unless patriarchy, other cultural restrictions, inequalities that affect women in developing countries are removed, you see, development projects towards such women will continue to fail. So they argued for the equitable distribution of resources, which recognizes the effect of inequalities, inequality among women in developing countries and how they face it. So this initiative offered a more critical view of women's their condition in the developing world and emphasized more on gender inequality and development focused on women. Now, Ward Initiative argued that the WEED approach lacked empathy towards women in developing world. The approach suggested the dominant global inequalities such as colonialism equally, that colonialism actually diminishes developing countries or developing women's freedom, and call for strategies to address, colonialism effectively. They also see the addressing that addressing poverty and colonialism will contribute to women's freedom and well-being. So the initiative also argued against the depiction of women as neglected resources, but suggested that women should rather be seen as overburdened and undervalued as a result. So therefore, according to this proponent, what should be paramount is a re-evaluation of development processes to ensure, redistribution of benefits and burdens of development between men and women. So, the gender and development. Let's discuss GAD. Now, the GAD emerged in the 1980s as alternative to the WEED and WAD. Central to this approach was the recognition that women are marginalized and the gender inequalities they face. Women are excluded from mainstream economic and social life, and as a result, they are likely to receive lesser benefits than men from development processes. So the initiative recognized that the heavy burden and double work as caregivers and sometimes breadwinners of the families, coupled with devastating economic in the South, affected women's livelihood and well-being. Of course, the feminization of poverty, or the weaponization of poverty against women, was observed as a significant indicator for the relevance of ensuring economic security of women faced with economic risk and shocks due to global economic crises and national GDP crippling. So, the solution advocated in this approach include increasing women's access to one social services, education, health, credit facilities, and of course other resources that might enhance their well-being and minimize their contribution in the wider society. I mean, maximize their contribution in the wider society or community rather. In addressing gender inequalities and differences that affect women and assigning rewarding strategies to mitigate them, the GUARD initiative required that three distinct questions be asked. One of them is who does what with what resources, who has access to resources, benefits, and opportunities, who control the resources and opportunities, who does what and with what resources. These questions are crucial. This question seeks to find out how resources are distributed and the level of discrimination that may affect women in terms of access to these resources. It also addresses the extent of available resources in the first place, as in who has access, that is, how many people will use the resources and opportunities, and what will be generated, for example, of resources including land, credit facilities, trainings, and so on. Who controls resources, that is, how many people, or men and women can have the resources and know how to use them. Now, let's look at module 3, women empowerment. We are actually coming getting to a close in this particular part, but it's very important to discuss women empowerment briefly. Mind you, it's a brief discussion just because it's a very wide topic to discuss, but we cannot do justice to it if we want to take even the entire of this training to discuss women empowerment. But women empowerment is what it is. It is women empowerment. They need to be empowered. Now, a Brazilian man, that's Paulo Freire, actually coined the concept of empowerment back in the days. He believed that disadvantaged populations should seek education as a way to empower themselves. Since the 1970s, however, many people have considered empowerment as being synonymous with women's empowerment. Now, empowerment is both a process and an improved end result. The women's empowerment approach takes participants through a facilitated process of identifying their place in patriarchy, setting goals for themselves, working towards those goals through improved access to knowledge, skill, and training. Mind you, knowledge, skill, and training is what was conceptualized as the gateway out of this empowerment or vulnerability that women were found, and it's believed that the right knowledge, skill, and training will bring them out, and that will be a form of empowerment. So women's empowerment is a process of self-actualization and confidence building. It involves integrating empowerment into any development sector. Is actually prone to yield improved results. So once you bring in the concept of empowerment in any sector at all, as far as developmental based, it's likely to improve the standard of living of women generally. And so that is basically what empowerment is all about. Women are empowered when they are given the right to express themselves, to discover themselves, to garner knowledge, skills, and trainings, the right training. Now, that is that about a woman empowerment for now. Talking about going further, we will discuss gender mainstreaming properly. This is the fourth slide. By the sixth slide, we should be running up. So, UNESCO defines gender mainstreaming as a strategy for making women as well as men, as men, concerns and experiences an integral dimension of the design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of the policies and programs in all political, economic, and social spheres, so that women and men can benefit equally and inequality is not encouraged. Now, gender mainstreaming allows development organizations align the objective of development initiatives with concerns of women and men. So, of course, this means that gender concern is seen as important in all aspects of development, sectors and areas of activities, and is fundamental part of the planning process. So whatever plan that is going on, is it government, in government, whether it's educational, is farming, whatever it is, it must be seen to inculcate or capture, the aspects of both genders. It must balance the gender. That's basically what it means. It also ensures that gender policies are executed according to organizational structure, structures, and are maintained. So, what are the issues in gender mainstreaming? Now, a gender mainstreaming is a strategy that recognizes the benefit of ensuring that both women and men benefit equally from all organizational policies, programs, and practices. In gender mainstreaming, the independent and complementary role of women and men is recognized. That's the essence. That you are mainstreaming, you are bringing together the gender benefits together. You are giving everyone his due. And of course, gender issues are not confined in one sector, but cut across various sectors of development and aim of transforming, all relations as well as the structure that maintain inequalities. So all these structures that create and maintain and perpetuate inequalities are taken away so as to bring about a balance. So gender mainstreaming should be addressed as part of normal institutional mainstreaming, and of course should not only be in purview of women expert or institution, rather it should be the responsibility of the entire organization and cannot be carried out in single factor or in isolation. So gender perspective and attention to the goal of gender equality is central to all activities and must take place in one, policy development, in the area of implementation of these policies, and advocacy activities. It should also be part of service delivery. It should be part of legislation. There should be laws to sanction it or to encourage, to promote it. There should be resource allocation towards this, dialogue, lobbying, and in all levels of project cycling. That is project planning, monitoring, and evaluation. Analytical tools for gender mainstreaming. There are a lot of tools, but I will just discuss gender analysis as one of the tools for gender mainstreaming. The analysis normally involves examining one, the difference in status of women and men, difference in access to assets, and of course resources and opportunities. It also looks at the influence of gender norms and of course laws in creating gender division of labor between paid and unpaid unemployment, and of course volunteer activities, constraint and opportunity in narrowing existing gender gaps, potential difference impact of development policies and programs on women and men. Now, it's very important to discuss something also that is critical. So the next module will take us to the gender policy in Nigeria. When we talk about policy, we're referring to those decisions or those either laws, regulations, basically, that determine the place of women in Nigeria as a government response or as a government, responsibility. So, by way of introduction, following many years of uncoordinated national response to women's issues, the gender policy in Nigeria was formulated to address issues facing women, especially gender-based discrimination and security issues women are faced with in the country. In the year 2000, the Nigerian government adopted and passed into law the National Policy on Women. The policy equally draws from the Beijing Platform of Action, that is BPA in particular, as this provides a unique opportunity for women to become a critical part of the decision-making process in development that are related to economic, political, and social development of the globe, and with a central concern on the elevation of poverty faced by women in societies. So we're talking about the fact that even though the policy is a global thing based on the Beijing document, but you see what we are narrowing down to the Nigerian experience in terms of its policy, because it is too wide, but we have to focus on Nigeria as a case study. So gender policy framework document prepared by the Federal Ministry of Women Affairs and Social Development has the following 4 pillars, namely: 1, policy reform with implication for mainstreaming gender concerns at all levels. provision of gender education and capacity building to ensure technical experience and positive gender culture, ensuring gender justice and human rights, and lastly, economic reform that will help enhance productivity and policy efficient and lasting outcome for the empowerment of women and vulnerable groups in Nigeria. So these are some of the key factors that informs the gender policy in Nigeria. Now, gender policy priority and thematic areas. There are a lot of areas that the gender policy in Nigeria tend to address. Now, to address this, to address its priority area, the policy allotted 17 thematic areas that dealt with women's issues in relation to overall national development as follows. One of them has with national development issues, family, culture, and socialization, gender-based violence, you see, as a concern, education, poverty, and economic employment and labor issues. We have agriculture and rural development as one of the issues. We have environment and natural resources, health and reproductive services, gender and HIV/AIDS. We have politics and decision making, gender, peace and conflict management. Of course, information, communication, and the media are all areas of concern for the policy. Of course, other forms of inequalities, that is vulnerable groups and inequalities in society, gender and physical services, legal and human rights, national and international partnership for development. So what are the constraints? There are certain constraints in the implementation of gender policies in Nigeria. We have some constraints actually. It's not easy because of the entrenched culture of marginalization against women. It is not easy to actually implement this gender policy effectively due to some of these constraints we're going to see. So although Nigeria has a very sound and robust policy on gender, it's rather unfortunate that the implementation of these policies has undergone several challenges since its formulation in 2000. That is this is 2023, over 23 years back, due to lack of political will, due to gender as core value for transforming Nigerian society was a controversial issue, because of patriarchy as well as coordination, networking, and monitoring impediments. So there was no proper coordination, networking, and monitoring. Now, there are prospects in the implementation of gender policies in Nigeria. There are prospects, even though there are challenges. For every challenge, there is a prospect. So one of them include enhancing political will. Once it can actually enhance political will, it can actually lead accepting gender equality as a core value for transforming the Nigerian society, role of gender norms and practices. These are some of the prospects. And of course, it also help to confront patriarchy. According to UNICEF, United Nations Children's Fund in 2011, the gain that will accrue from dismantling the impact of patriarchy on women's lot in Nigeria include, so by ending gender the dominance of women by men, or destroying the structures that encourages discrimination against women, it will help to provide enduring gender role relations as women and men balance their different roles and responsibilities within the private and public spheres of life, and enhance exchange of social skills between women and men is enhanced. There will also be freedom of choice and balance of power in matters of sexuality, reproduction, and reproductive health. There will also be improved quality of life, at the household level, and of course, talent and potential of boys and girls, will be promoted, nurtured, and tapped for development. There will be improved leadership terrain through the full use of leadership skills and style of women and men. Of course, a more humane social climate will be achieved as the need of men and women, old and young, boys and girls, rich and poor, become the focus of policies and development plans become more sustainable. So there will be proper coordination and networking. Yes, gender mainstreaming can help to achieve proper coordination and networking. So this refers to the extent to which institutions, organizations, and civil society have been able to coordinate and network together to bring about best practice for implementing gender policies in Nigeria. A critical area of these stakeholders can assess include the effectiveness. That is a critical area these stakeholders can actually assess include the effectiveness of gender analysis tools, accountability and transparency issues, and of course budget. This can only be achieved through well targeted, coordinated networking and monitoring efforts. We are coming towards the end, but look at gender issue of women and political participation in Nigeria. We can't talk about women policy on women without talking about their political participation. Very important. We are going to end on this model, but just know that there is a lot of work to be done when we talk about women participation in political or decision-making processes of position. This is the essence, one of the essence of the gender policy in Nigeria. And so, by way of introduction, equitable participation of women in politics and government is essential to building and maintaining or sustaining democracy. Democracy is government for the people, by the people, for the people. The people refers to both men and women. It's not government by the men, for the men, and for the men. No. So, though they comprise over 50% of the world's population, women continue to be underrepresented in political issues and decision-making positions. Lack of participation in political issues also affects the level of information we'll have to deal with marginalization and discrimination that affect women. So the patriarchal system actually found that most parts of Nigeria challenge the ability to be represented properly or participate in politics because in patriarchal societies, women's voice are silent and decisions are actually made for them. You see, here we will further look at how gender inequality affects the way women in Nigeria are represented or participate in politics and government and in decision making processes. So, what is the level of women's political participation in Nigeria? Equitable participation of women in politics and government is a sine qua non or necessity for building and sustaining democracy. I've said that before. But you see, despite all effort made by the international community and of course organizations like the Kingsland Foundation, through initiatives, programs, policies, and plans, and of course the national government, women still face gender-based structures that maintain differences and subjugation of women under men. Now, level of women's political participation in Nigeria. These structures have consolidation in people's cultural norms, beliefs, values, and practices, which are often very hard to adjust in order for women to gain recognition in society. There are entrenched beliefs and cultures that undermine the position of women in politics, that discourages them from venturing into political positions that will help them to make political decisions. So the assumption that women's role is to procreate, simply to procreate, provide caregiving, attention to the family, and do house chores and subsistence economic activities like farming, at the backyard, relegated women to the background of anything political in the country. In recent times, the appalling situation is that Nigerian women find themselves in a hostile political environment so unconducive that they feel despaired and discouraged to participate in or vie for leadership position in government or governance of this nation. You see, there are factors that affect women's participation in politics in Nigeria. We're going to discuss these factors. One of them is entrenched cultural practice. The assumption that the politics is the birthright of men in most parts of the country, and that women have no business playing political games. This is one of them. Entrenched cultural practices. This is one of the factors that affect their participation in politics in Nigeria. Another assumption is that women prefer to be considered decision makers. Okay, that men prefer to be considered decision makers at all levels of social life. Hence, women are considered followers. They are only to follow. They don't have what it takes to lead. That is the assumption. That social conventions, values, and morals combine to maintain the stereotype of Nigeria's women as kitchen, dwellers, with only gate crashers who are only considered gate crashers in sphere outside of the matrimonial home. So women are considered as just caregivers, home owners, home managers, what they call, like a former president would say, for the kitchen, and the other room. So women are just considered as maid for the kitchen and the bedroom. But that is wrong. So religious belief and values also contribute. Religion equally plays a critical role in this, diminishing opportunities for women to engage in politics. With some religions will discourage women should not lead, women should not, know that religion creates a stereotypical structure that maintain gender inequality and enhance gender gap between women and men in society. So it actually plays a role. Poverty and illiteracy is also a major factor. Poverty and illiteracy affect women's options in engaging in politics. Political arena is an elite zone. It's considered an elite zone in all societies. It's not for everybody. And being part of this elite class demands certain standards of life, of which wealth, connection, and education plays a critical role. Most women do not have this. Where poverty affects women, the tendency is for them to overlook immediate needs. So the survival for it becomes their watchword rather than participation in politics, which becomes very rare. So male dominance in political and economic sector is another factor why there's virtually which affects women's participation in politics in Nigeria, or the political decision making process. So males' purview in the country has always been in politics and economy, with their continued dominance over these sectors, which are critical in well-being. Level of access and engagement of women in the political arena is highly challenged. Another factor is misconceived role of women in politics. There's this misconception. Some people assume that women in politics are, that they are either promiscuous or insubordinate to men. That no woman can join politics. She has to be insubordinate to her husband. She has to be a prostitute. She has to just be promiscuous. That's a wrong assumption. So wrong and unjust labeling like this can actually deter or discourage serious women from coming out of their shells to participate in politics. All this must be dealt with. There has to be reorientation or reorganization, restructuring of our minds, societal minds, towards the positive aspects, the developments that can come by virtue of women's participation in politics, as against what they've been brainwashed, fed with over time. So a violent nature of politics in Nigeria is also another factor. Nigeria and Africa generally is a factor. Women are mostly seen as weaker sex, and so they do not have the capacity to endure certain ill game played in daunted politics. When you see thugs, parading around with weapons, with guns, and all kinds of things, and they make politics look very dirty and nasty, as if it's the jungle where it is survival of the fittest. Women by nature are not violent. They will run away from that. When politics becomes like a war, elections in Nigeria is like war. I said they're preparing for war. You see me? It's very appalling. So the violence that elude just and peaceful political activities have come to affect the capacity of women, even the psychology. It affects the psychology and their capacity to therefore their interest in politics in the country and in the continent at large. This could also be the reason why most women, appall or do not like politics. Now, repressive nature of socialization and low self-esteem is another reason. Internalized value of being the second-class citizen in the country after the male folks can affect women's interest in politics. If you're considered second class, that alone can have this draining, ripple effect on you. One may begin to consider themselves as unable or disabled. Psychologically, they become crippled, and they begin to think that it is true that they are second class, so they have nothing to offer. That is what sustained psychological damage can do. So being engaged, another one, women's multiple role and time constraints. Women play multiple roles, severally, so that affects them. For instance, being engaged in both productive and reproductive roles as mothers. They are mothers, they are wives, they are caregivers, they are even workers at home, at work, and sometimes breadwinners for the family. It actually denies women enough time to engage in political activities. Where does she have the time to cook, or to run to the market, or to go to work and still nurse children and still be the all that it can be critical, very critical. Another factor is lack of solidarity among women. Women themselves are their, as I always say, women are their own enemies. Most women, out of jealousy, envy, and the inferiority complex and other factors, would prefer to support if a man to succeed politically than protect. It is a normal thing. Than it, and when I say normal, it's not normal, but it is a fact that has always been repeating itself. So this is true when we see the reaction of women towards women in politics and the level of support they give them during election or campaign. You see, it is time women start supporting women as well. Now there are measures for improving women's participation in politics in Nigeria. What are all these measures? We have identified the problems, the challenges. Now what are the measures? What are the way forward? What's the way forward? One of them is building mass coalition of women support and advocacy group. Using NGOs and grassroots women associations to coordinate support and advocacy for fellow women aspirants, like what we're doing here. We need more voices to talk about this, to do more training, to encourage people, to empower women to come out and not just exercise their votes. No, not just be women leaders and support. No, let them also be supported this time around to become presidents. Now, Kingsland Foundation has a project which we've been working on over the years, and we're promoting it. It is a political pageantry. It's aimed at promoting female participation in governance, in politics. Please watch out for this very special project. Now, political parties should create, it's a way of encouraging women participation in politics. So political parties should also create support network for prospective aspirants by pairing them with established women politicians who will be playing key roles as mentors and provide capacity building for young and aspiring female politicians to enhance and develop them ahead of subsequent elections. Yes, pair, encourage them, pair. Make sure if the governor is a man, the deputy should be female. If the governor is a female, the deputy should be male. Something like that. Pair them, encourage them, push them. Of course, some parties have tried by way of providing affirmative action, like making forms almost free for female politicians, which is an encouragement. That's encouraging. Establishment of legal fund to assist women in women politicians, in electoral issues of electoral malpractice and other forms of political processes, and all that. Introduction of quota system as gender equality measures. So make sure they introduce this quota system that, okay, for instance, in National Assembly where you have over 300 and so, you have insist that social percentage should go to women, and all that. Introduction of quota system as gender equality measures at all levels of governance, and in identifying and engaging relevant stakeholders such as INEC and political parties to ensure that strict adherence to women equality measures in all electoral processes. That's another incentive. Also, creating enabling environment that allow women to engage meaningfully in decision-making process in a sustainable and, of course, effective way that is free from violence and harassment of any kind. These are some of the measures that can help to not just encourage women to participate in politics, but to interest them, and it makes it a part, something that's worth doing. And then, of course, that way we'll achieve more. Let me say that the idea is not just having women in politics, but it's the fact that two good heads are better than one. When the women bring in their own, women are considered emotional and all that. When they bring in their emotion and the men bring in their logic, you have a balance. But where it is only we only led by, that is why more problems are caused in this world by men. The men are been responsible for almost all the wars in the world, for all the deaths, for most of the poverty, the crisis in the world. When they say give women a chance, we're not just talking about gender. We're saying give mothers a chance. With the heart of mothers, they should be able to lead with sympathy, with compassion. We need more compassionate leaders. We need more passionate leaders with compassion to lead, and that's what we're talking about. It's not about someone with with a private part that is different from that of a male. We're not just talking about the biology or the gender. We're talking about an agenda. We're talking about what they have to bring to the table, what they've been endowed with. That we need that variety that God created the diversity as a strength, not as a weakness. With this, we've come to the end of this training. I want to believe you were highly impacted. Please spread this knowledge, expand it, practice it, and let's see how the women can advance and how our world will get better. Because it is stated, it is clear, it's a fact that when given opportunity, women tend to excel, and we have to keep pushing this. We have to keep practicing this to see how far we go. Thank you, and God bless.